There's only one way to find out.
You have chosen wisely.
Germany has declared war on the Jones boys.
Those people are trying to kill us.
I know, Dad!
It's a new experience for me.
Happens to me all the time.
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Yours truly, Brevin Thompson, is back to continue 80s May with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. When it comes to deciding which is my favorite film in the original Indiana Jones trilogy, it's kind of hard for me to decide which is my favorite, because when it comes to Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Last Crusade, I love those films so much because those mean a lot to me. Raiders of the Lost Ark is easily one of the best films ever made, and when it comes to Temple of Doom, while not as good as Raiders, it was very unique and tried to do something different. But when it comes to the Last Crusade, it really truly feels like a true follow-up to Raiders, because it brings back certain characters like Marcus and Sala. Indy fights the Nazis again in this film, and he goes after another biblical artifact in this film. While in Raiders he went after the Ark of the Covenant, this time he's after the Holy Grail. But my favorite aspect of this film in regards to its story is the relationship between Indy and his father, who is portrayed brilliantly by Sean Connery, may he rest in peace. And that's really fascinating, having Sean Connery, James Bond himself, as Indiana Jones' father. And I think that was perfect casting. And I like that Spielberg always had Sean Connery in mind, because he was always a huge fan of his work as James Bond. And could you blame him, really? But before I discuss my thoughts on The Last Crusade, I have my good friend Ryan Kim collaborating with me on The Last Crusade. It's good to have him back. We've been talking about the Indiana Jones films during 80s May, and I'm glad to have him back to talk about The Last Crusade. So before I discuss my thoughts on this film, it's your go, Ryan.
Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Cam. I want to thank Brevin once again for having me back on his channel. And this time in our Indiana Jones series, we have finally approached The Last Crusade. This is by far and away my favorite Indiana Jones movie, and quite frankly, it's not even a competition. I think that, objectively speaking, Raiders of the Lost Ark is the best, but subjectively, Last Crusade has my heart for a lot of reasons. Pretty much my love of this movie boils down to one thing: Mr. Ford and Mr. Connery. Basically, this movie portrays Sean Connery as Henry Jones Sr. and Harrison Ford as Henry Jones Jr. Now, Sean Connery is sadly no longer with us. May he rest in peace. He is primarily known for two reasons: James Bond and this, and there is a good reason why he is known for this. Much has been said about the chemistry between these two actors, and honestly, I'd just be preaching to the choir. What I will say is that this is some of the best on-screen chemistry that I think I've ever seen in a movie, and will ever see in a movie, quite frankly. You learn so much about them just through their conversations with each other. The exposition in this movie is so good that you don't really... You're not, listening to this thinking, oh, this is clearly dialogue being spoken to me. No, you fully believe that these people are related and that they have a history together. One of my favorite scenes in the movie, honestly, has nothing to do with any fighting. It's actually after a fight. It's when Indy and his dad are in that motorcycle, and they are fighting over whether or not they should go to Brody or to Berlin. And Ford just is like, we have the map, and Henry Sr. is like, we need the diary, and they're just going back and forth, and then it just breaks down to where you just see all the dirt, and it is handled so very well. The villain of the movie is a twofer of Walter Donovan and Elsa Schneider. I think, in terms of villains, the 4 Indy villains that we've had so far, I would argue that Walter Donovan is the most vicious. I mean, yes, we had the villain in Temple of Doom, and he literally ripped a man's heart from his chest. But, I mean, Walter Donovan is a rich dude who clearly has money to burn and has no time for anything sentimental. He wants the Holy Grail and will literally do anything to get it. He is a cold and heartless bastard. Elsa Schneider is a really good character in this as well, and she has great rapport with Indy. Even after her turn to the dark side, she is still entertaining on screen. And honestly, I could talk about this movie for days and days and days. There is so much good stuff in here. Every action scene is done so perfectly, from the opening scene with young Indy fighting off those goons, rest in peace River Phoenix, to the tank scene, my personal favorite, to the finale where Indy has to navigate the 3 tests to eventually find the Holy Grail. There is not a single moment of this movie where I was just like, oh, come on, that's so fake. And I have seen this movie conservatively in the double digits, like high double digits. I've seen this movie quite a bit. And every time I see it, I am just consistently impressed by just the craft that was put into this. In a third movie, no less. There's a certain reputation when it comes to movie sequels that, yeah, movie sequels are always, like, just worse than the first. And, well, there are rare exceptions to this. That is the general rule. And it's even worse with third movies. I think you could count the number of good third movies on, like, one hand and have fingers to spare. I would comfortably put Last Crusade in the conversation alongside Return of the King as greatest third movies of all time. If for some reason you have never seen this movie, if you need to watch any Indiana Jones movie, skip Raiders of the Lost Ark and watch Last Crusade first. From a character standpoint, I think it is the best work from Steven Spielberg, from Harrison Ford in this role, and it's the last ounce of indie greatness. Afterwards, we get to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and I'm not entirely sure if Brevin wants to talk about that one. I can understand if he doesn't, but hopefully Indy 5, again, hopefully, touches Last Crusade. It's a lofty task, but I hope that is the case. But I would like to thank Brevin for having me back onto this channel and for me basically gushing about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for a few minutes. Back to you.
When it comes to the opening flashback sequence when we see young Indy played by River Phoenix, I love how beautifully executed this sequence is. I mean, we see Indy coming across these grave robbers who are after the Cross of Coronado. Indy takes the cross so it can be preserved in a museum. We get a chase scene with Indy on a horse. He gets on a train, and he comes across his greatest fear, which is snakes. And when he comes across a lion, he first uses a bullwhip for the first time, and he gets that scar on his chin like Harrison Ford did in real life due to a car accident. And after all this, he impresses the leader of the grave robbers, who looks exactly like Indy as he is now. I mean, he has the jacket, he has the fedora. And one interesting thing is that the original idea for that character is he was originally going to be Abner Ravenwood, the father of Marion Ravenwood from Raiders and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And after hearing about that, I'm just like, why would you change that? I'm like, that, can you imagine how amazing of an idea that was? I mean, I wish they could have gone with it, but yeah. How this sequence ends with him giving Indy his fedora, and then we cut to Indy played by Harrison Ford, who is still after the Cross of Coronado so he can give it to Marcus Brody. You begin to realize that this is starting to feel like a true follow-up to Raiders. I mean, we see Indy as a teacher writing on the chalkboard. He talks to Marcus again, and we get our exposition scene, because these films often have an exposition scene regarding the MacGuffin of these films, because in Raiders you had the Ark of the Covenant, and Temple you had the Sharkara Stones. And when he discusses the Holy Grail with Walter Donovan, who's played by Julian Glover, who I'm pretty sure that a lot of Star Wars fans would recognize him as General Veers from The Empire Strikes Back. And while Indy is translating the Grail tablet, Donovan reveals that Indy's father was his project leader on the Holy Grail, because Henry has been obsessed with finding the Grail his entire life. And when Indy goes to his house and finds it ransacked, he realizes that someone was after his father's Grail diary, which contains all of his research regarding the Holy Grail. So Indy and Marcus go to Venice, and they meet Elsa, played by Alison Doody. She's definitely one of the more interesting love interests for Indy in this franchise for one reason, which I'll get to later. They go to this library and they find these Roman numerals, which is part of a clue that Henry left in his Grail diary. And I like how when Indy sees the 10, which is this big X, in one scene earlier in the classroom, he says that X never ever marks the spot in archaeology and stuff like that. And he's forced to admit that X marks the spot. And I think that's pretty brilliant. And the scene with the stamp guy just stamping all these books while Indy is crushing the floorboard is so hilarious. And I laugh every single time I see this scene. Indy and Elsa go to this catacomb, which is filled with rats. And interestingly enough, they bred rats specifically for this scene. I mean, can you picture that? Like, breeding rats for an Indiana Jones film? It's good. It's a good thing that they didn't bring, any other rats that didn't have any, diseases or anything like that. Eventually, Indy and Elsa find the second marker, which is on this shield, which reveals the location of the Grail. Then that's when the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword comes in and they try to kill them. They're an organization that protects the Holy Grail to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. So after the boat chase scene, Indy and Elsa go to this castle. And interestingly enough, the original idea for this film was that George Lucas originally wanted the third movie to take place in a haunted mansion or a haunted castle that would have had the Fountain of Youth. But Spielberg didn't want to do another haunting movie because he already did Poltergeist before doing Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And that would have been an interesting concept, Indy in a haunted castle. I mean, I honestly would have wanted to... I really would have wanted to see that, but I'm really happy with what we got in The Last Crusade. Indy is eventually reunited with his father, and when it comes to Harrison Ford and Sean Connery's chemistry, it is beautiful. I always love watching these two together, and they are so great to watch on screen. They're eventually captured by the Nazis, and Elsa is actually revealed to be in league with the Nazis, which is an interesting idea to have Indy's love interest in league with the bad guys. And of course, Donovan is revealed to be in league with the Nazis too. And they get the Grail diary, and then they capture Marcus, and they're on their way to retrieve the Grail. And the scene with Indy and Henry tied up, and Indy trying to get his dad to burn through the ropes with his lighter, but he ends up dropping it, and he sets the room on fire. It's pretty hilarious, and it adds a little bit of tension at the same time. And I like John Williams' score in this one scene, and with him, hopping around and just trying to get out of this situation, and it leads to this motorcycle chase, which is still awesome. And after this action sequence, we get this argument over whether or not they should go like Ryan mentioned, whether they should go to Marcus or go to Berlin to retrieve the diary, because Henry reveals that if you find the Grail, you have to go against 3 challenges, which were basically booby traps. He has the clues, but he doesn't remember the clues, so they go to Berlin, and Indy bumps into Hitler. And this moment with Indy with the diary disguised as a Nazi, he bumps into Hitler, and Hitler takes the book for a second, and he doesn't even realize that that is Henry's Grail diary, the book that he desires, and he decides to give him an autograph because that's what he believed this supposed member of his army wants, which is kind of interesting and kind of funny at the same time, because he's like, yeah, okay, you want an autograph? Okay, here you go. And the scene on the blimp is easily the most hilarious moment out of any Indiana Jones film, where this one Nazi is looking for Henry and Indy. He finds Henry, and Indy is wearing a disguise, asking for tickets, and the Nazi, he doesn't have a ticket, so he punches him and throws him out of the blimp. I mean, he looks at all the passengers, he says, no ticket, and the passengers, they all show their tickets. That makes me laugh my ass off every single time, and it's easily the funniest scene out of any Indiana Jones film. The scene on the plane is also pretty interesting, and while Henry is trying to shoot the Nazis' planes with a machine gun, he accidentally like shoots the tail of the plane, and he's like, I'm sorry, son, they got us. And we get a car chase, and some of the effects, and that's especially that scene with that one shot of the plane where as like sliding down this tunnel. I'm just like, good lord, that is amazing, even after 30 years. And the one moment with Henry having this idea to have to use his umbrella to make the seagulls like crash into the plane and then causing the plane to crash. I love the line that he gives after that scene.
Suddenly remembered my Charlemagne. Let my armies be the rocks and the trees and the birds in the sky.
And when it comes to the tank chase, I love everything about this scene with Henry and Marcus on the tank, and Indy like riding on a horse trying to figure out how to get them out of there. Him sticking a rock into the barrel of one of the guns on the tank and causing that to backfire. That is awesome. And of course, him fighting the Nazi general on top of the tank, and him like going through all of these obstacles and trying to do everything to save Marcus and his dad. And when the tank goes over that cliff, Henry is like terrified that he probably lost his son, and we get this moment where he like regrets not telling his son that he truly cares about him and he loves him. And when Indy is standing like right behind him and he's wondering what they're looking at, Henry has this amazing look of relief and quickly embraces Indy. It is such a beautiful moment, and like I said, it's easily my favorite father and son relationship in a film. And the third act of the film is easily my favorite third act of the Indiana Jones films. When Donovan shoots Henry to force Indy to go get the Grail, and Indy is forced to do the 3 challenges: the Penitent Men will pass, the Word of God, and the Path of God. Only the penitent men will pass, only in the footsteps of God will he proceed, and only in the leap of a lion's head will he prove his worth. And the first test, I mean, he has to dodge this blade. I'm just like, holy shit. And even as a kid, when I first saw that, I was like, whoa, he better do something to, like, get past through that. And him, like, having to, like, spell Jehovah in Latin is also pretty clever. And the invisible bridge effect, that is still amazing after 30 plus years. Indy meets the Grail Knight, who drank from the Holy Grail and has gained eternal life, and he has to stay within the temple, and he can't pass the Great Seal. Donovan comes in, and Elsa purposely chooses the Golden Cup, the wrong Grail, for Donovan. He drinks from it, and this is easily one of my favorite death scenes for a villain in a film, because the effects of seeing Donovan age rapidly after choosing the wrong Grail, I miss effects like this. And of course we get, he chose poorly. Indy eventually chooses the right Grail, and of course that's when the knight says, you have chosen wisely. Indy eventually uses the Grail to save his father, and when Elsa's greed overcomes her and she passes the seal, the temple begins to collapse, and that's when she tries to get the Grail for herself, which eventually causes her death. And when Indy is in the same situation as Elsa and he tries to get the Grail, and Henry tries to persuade Indy not to, and he says Indiana to get Indy's attention. He doesn't call him Junior, and because in the film he mostly calls him Junior, and Indy is mostly annoyed by that. But when Henry calls Indy Indiana, he says the name that he prefers to be known by, and he persuades Indy to let it go. And of course, I love the final shot with Indy, Henry, Marcus, and Sala riding off into the sunset, which is a perfect way to close the Indiana Jones franchise. And it was definitely a perfect ending for the franchise, in my personal opinion anyway. But of course we know that this wasn't the end of the franchise, since they made Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which I definitely will talk about in more detail in future, but in terms of the trilogy, I can't think of a better way to close the trilogy that how Spielberg did, because Spielberg is easily one of the best in the business. This is easily one of my favorite films, and of course, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade gets an A+. Thank you again, Ryan, for collaborating with me on The Last Crusade. It was so great to have you collaborate with me on the original Indiana Jones trilogy. And guys, what did you think about The Last Crusade? Let me know in the comments below. And guys, thank you so much as always for watching. Looking forward to doing more videos really soon. And if you want my thoughts on old or new films, of course, you know where to find me.